So we've been doing a series since Easter talking about, I called the first few weeks Watershed, and then this last few weeks I've called Divergent, not because I'm trying to capitalize on teen fiction, although that wouldn't hurt if we get 2 or 3 hits from the internet for that. I have been tagging the videos on YouTube with that term, and we'll just see. There's going to be some very disappointed teen fiction fans, I think, if they look that up. But the idea is that divergent is something, the word divergent really means to change course entirely, to become something absolutely different than what you were before. And that's what happened to the people who spent time with Jesus. So before, we talked about, one of my favorites we talked about was his brother, James, who didn't believe in Jesus, which is got to be awkward at family dinners and stuff. You know, your brother, everybody thinks he's the Messiah. You don't think he's the Messiah. In fact, Jesus' whole family, except probably Mary, was, kind of looking askew at Jesus and going, well, it's possible that he's insane and we need to take him home for some professional help. But James becomes a follower of Jesus afterwards. We talked about John and the things that he wrote. The resurrection just changes people into completely different kinds of people. I wanted to continue on talking with Peter a little bit this week, because Peter is like one of my favorite New Testament characters, because he's crazy and he jumps out of boats and he cuts people's ears off and he cusses and he says all kinds of things, and Peter's just like the wild card disciple, and yet Jesus renames him the Rock. He says, your name is not Simon, but it's going to be Peter, which is a word that means the Rock, which is interesting for a guy who is most well known for being kind of like unstable and unsteady. He's like, yeah, you're the Rock, and I'm going to build my church around the kinds of things that you believe. But one of my favorite stories about Peter is kind of a two-parter. It starts with the fact that Peter, after Jesus is taken from the garden and he's betrayed and he's on trial, Peter has this moment where he's standing out in the courtyard, and even though he had been willing to fight for Jesus and he had just cut a guy's ear off and he'd done all these crazy things, he immediately after that was afraid, and so he denied even knowing Jesus, to the point that he cussed somebody out, and he denied knowing Jesus 3 times, and that's that famous story in the Bible. Peter denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows. Depending on which of the Gospels you read, it's either the rooster crows twice or the rooster crows, whichever one. The funny thing about that story is that it's in all 4 Gospels. Not every story that we know about Jesus and his disciples are in all 4 of those first books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This one is definitely in all 4 of them. And it makes me think that the rest of the disciples were like, man, remember when Peter did that? And they specifically wrote it down because it was just this crazy thing where Jesus predicted it would happen, and then it happened, and Peter he's unsteady. He's just he flows in and out. And the thing that's interesting is you read the story. Let me read a little bit of it to you so you can see what exactly happened. He says, they seized Jesus, took him away to the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when someone there had started a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down with them. So here's Peter. He's kind of sneaking into the courtyard. He's hanging out. He's just sitting around a fire. A servant girl, meaning an unimportant person, but just a servant girl, saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him," but he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. Which is a great response. "Woman, I don't know him." A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." Peter's response, "Man, I am not." So it's just like the 70s Peter. Woman, man. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he was a Galilean." If you read some of the other Gospels, it says, "You must be with him because of your accent." So the Galilean accent was like the Tennessee or the Alabama accent to us. Galilee is like a backwater kind of a place. So in fact, you find in the book of Acts that the thing that amazed people the most about the disciples is they're like, aren't these all guys from Galilee? It was like kind of saying, aren't these all guys from Kentucky? Sort of a stereotype of an uneducated person. I'm sure there's wonderfully educated people in Kentucky, but it's a handy stereotype that we use. We'll cut that out of the internet. I'm going to get like protested by Kentuckians with their trucks. Man, I am not, Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, here, he's a Galilean. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about that. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you'll disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. That's Luke 22. If you think about that, let's just take away the fact that this is a Bible story and we're talking about Jesus and apostles and all these kinds of things. Think of this as a person, right? And his best friend, his leader, his mentor has just been arrested. And his response when people start to say, oh, you're connected with that guy that is being arrested and tried in there, it'd be like, there's a court trial happening and Peter is sitting on the steps outside where all the media is, has their cameras, and they're like, hey, weren't you, we've seen you with Jesus before. And he goes, oh no, I've never heard of the guy. I just happened to be here at midnight because it's a good place to hang out. If you think about Peter, what is Peter's problem at this point? His problem really is that he's afraid of people. He's afraid of what they'll do to him. He's afraid of the fact that, Jesus was just arrested, so he doesn't want to be arrested. He's following at a distance. He's concerned about what people think. And obviously, this is a kind of a weird situation. We don't face it very often where a friend of ours is on trial for their life and we might also be arrested and on trial for their life. So maybe we give Peter a pass here. Maybe he's just trying to, be incognito. He's trying to make sure that he doesn't get arrested too. But it's interesting that later on in the Bible, you find that Peter continues to have this problem. He continues to be worried about what people think of him. In fact, he's concerned about the negative opinion that people have. And it reminds me of the old saying that people don't really change, right? You ever heard somebody say that? And you know somebody and maybe they've done something in the past and you say, well, so-and-so, you know them. They did this before, so I just assume that that's what they're going to do in the future. We assume that, don't we? We think that about people. And the other thing that's true is that it is actually really hard to change who you are. There are certain things, and this is true, and if you think about it and if you're honest with yourself, there are certain things in your life that are kind of hardwired in you, right? You react certain ways in certain situations. You have certain emotions. You have certain ways of responding to people. Maybe it's how you deal with pressure and stress. Maybe it's like Peter, what other people think about you matters a lot. Maybe you're prone to a lot of different things. Some people are prone to addictive behaviors, and some people are prone to having emotional struggles, and some of us are prone to maybe the opposite side of things. Maybe you're really prone to being overly confident and proud and arrogant, or maybe you're prone to being afraid of what people might say, like Peter was. There are a lot of things that are just sort of defaults for us. And one of the things I learned early in life was that people have default settings a lot like, I work in technology, so we program systems, and one of the things is that a system that you program doesn't do anything unless you tell it to do it. And one of the things you can do is if you lose power or the system resets or whatever it happens to be, you can have default settings in the system. So you can save certain settings And that way, if something restarts or reboots, everything goes back to zero. People are not far off from that, really. If you can spend a lot of time trying to be different and trying to improve, but unless something significantly changes in your defaults, in kind of the baseline of who you are, given the right opportunity, you will go exactly back to those defaults. I always say that you can figure out what your default settings are by applying pressure or stress or conflict or danger to your life. If you look at how you react, not when you're really at your best and you have all the energy in the world and you have lots of resources to deal with things, but you can figure out, for instance, how you feel about money when you don't have any, right? You can figure out how you deal with your family, not when everything is going good and when you're not having conflict with each other, but when somebody is doing something that you hate and somebody is doing something that angers you. I can tell you how much you like your job, not by how it is on your very best day, but how it is on the worst day when your boss gives you a bad review or the customer is just a pain or it's hard and you're tired. One of the acronyms we use in counseling is called HALT. You should really think about the decisions you're going to make if you're hurting, angry, lonely, or tired. And if you're in any one of those situations, you can look at the way that you react, and that's probably something about your default settings, who you are. Now, back to that saying, people never change, right? Well, people don't really change. They might, vary just a little bit, but at the end of the day, people are always the same. If I believed that, I think I would be a very depressed person. Because I want to believe that I can change, that the things that are defaults for me sometimes that stress me out or whatever, the things I don't like about myself, I want to believe that those can change. But I also want to believe that other people can change. And sometimes, when you're dealing with people, it can be really frustrating because you think, well, this is never going to change. This is always how it's going to be. And I think it's generally true, except if something massive and life-changing happens in your life. In the case of Peter, he's still got some default settings that he deals with. I'll tell you a fun story about him in a minute. But there's been a massive change in his life. And for the most part, he's moved those defaults from maybe here to here. Now, there's still some weaknesses with him when it comes to what people think of him. But generally, he's gone from being afraid and being very timid and cussing out a little slave girl for no good reason to all the way over here where he's able to stand up on the day of Pentecost and say to thousands and thousands of people who had just killed Jesus 50 days earlier, he's able to stand up and say, this is who Jesus is. It's a great speech. It includes the phrase, Jesus who you crucified. So he's accusing the crowd of murder, so it's great stuff. And instead of being afraid like he was before, he's very bold. But then, later on, here's what happens. If you read in Galatians chapter 2, I'm going to read it in the Message, because it's kind of a great story form version. Paul is another apostle, right? So Paul and Peter had met each other, and Peter had said, okay, Paul, even though you used to kill Christians, now you're an okay guy, and we respect you, and all that kind of stuff. And Paul comes into a city, and Peter is there. And Peter is doing something that Paul recognizes is not right. And so Paul and Peter have this conflict. They have this moment where Paul actually rebukes Peter. He says, Peter, what you're doing is wrong. So here's the story. He says, when I saw that they were not maintaining a steady, straight course according to the message, I spoke up to Peter in front of all of them. What is he talking about? Well, here's what had happened a few verses earlier. He says, when Peter came to Antioch, I had a face-to-face confrontation with him because he was clearly out of line. Here's the situation. Earlier, before certain persons had come from James, Peter ate regularly with the non-Jews. But when the conservative group came from Jerusalem, he cautiously pulled back and put as much distance as he could manage between himself and his non-Jewish friends. So here's Peter, afraid of what people think, and he's putting some distance between himself and his non-Jewish friends. Why? Because there are some people who have come in and are judgmental. That's how fearful he was of the conservative Jewish clique that's been pushing the old system of circumcision. Unfortunately, the rest of the Jews in the Antioch church joined in that hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was swept along in the charade. And then Paul says this to Peter. I spoke up to Peter in front of them all. If you, a Jew, live like a non-Jew when you're not being observed by the watchdogs from Jerusalem, what right do you have to require non-Jews to conform to Jewish customs? I know that was circular and it's confusing. We'll get to it. Just to make a favorable impression on your old Jerusalem cronies. We Jews know that we have no advantage of birth over non-Jewish sinners. We know very well that we're not set right with God by rule keeping, but only through personal faith in Jesus Christ. How do we know? We tried it, and we had the very best system of rules the world had ever seen. Convinced that no human being can please God by self-improvement. It's a great line. We believed in Jesus as Messiah so that we might be set right before God by trusting the Messiah, not by trying to be good. And Peter, I'm really glad this story is in the Bible, because here's Peter who struggled with this before the crucifixion, and after he still struggles with this a little bit. And the good news is he's got Paul to come along and say, to correct him and to remind him, hey, this is not the way to be. But what it comes down to is Peter is just stuck in that old default of being afraid of what people think and being afraid of those who are being judgmental. Our weaknesses and our struggles can be defaults, and that's true for Peter, and that's true for us. But it gives me hope that this story is in the Bible, because if Peter can overcome this, if Peter can be who Peter was, which, the greatest apostle and leader of the church and all this kind of stuff, the rock, if Peter can be that, and yet he can still struggle with stuff, then I think that gives me hope that I can do something great with my life and still struggle with the stuff I struggle with. And I really believe that Jesus gives us the ability and the power to overcome our defaults. That you don't have to look at the things in your life and say, okay, this is how I am. This is just how it's going to be. I'm always going to struggle with this. I'm always going to struggle with jealousy or pride or low self-esteem or whatever it happens to be. Jesus says that he can give us a new life. And by allowing him to speak to us, by reading the words that he said, and by trying to do the things that he taught us to do, not by trying to be good, but by trying to follow him and listen to him and live like him, we can actually change our defaults. We can actually become somebody different. We can actually change into different kinds of people. But it's not easy, and it's not automatic. As you saw for Peter, it's something that he kept working on. And you'll find this all throughout the New Testament, that people talk about the idea that we are continually being made more and more like Jesus. We're not there. We haven't attained it. We haven't figured it all out. And for me in my life, I think having grown up the way I did and the kinds of things that I have struggled with throughout my life, it's been great to look back and see how God has moved me along, to see that I'm no longer concerned about my value and my worth in the world. And I grew up really concerned about that. I really grew up thinking that I didn't matter, and I really grew up thinking that I had a lot of problems with those kinds of things, self-esteem and seeing my worth and my value in Jesus. But Jesus has steadily changed my heart and changed who I am. And the more I spend time reading his word and in prayer and trying to live like him, the more I inch my way towards being like him, and the more those default settings just move to where now my default isn't, I don't even know if God loves me. My default is, I know God loves me. I know God has a great plan for my life. And maybe my default's over here where I'm going, well, I'm not sure if I'm measuring up. Well, that's okay. So we're going to move that one forward a little bit too by reading scriptures like there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, who are called according to his purpose. So your defaults can move over time. And that's what I wanted to say tonight. I wanted to talk about Peter, the fact that he still messed up a long time after the resurrection, and that should give us all hope. And why don't we do this? We have a few questions that we could discuss. So we do this every week where we sit around and we talk to each other and we say, okay, if you can reveal them, now this may be a little too personal or private, something you don't want to talk about, but if you want to reveal them, if you want to talk about them, what are some of the default settings you deal with? So I started by being a little bit vulnerable with you guys. So if you feel like being vulnerable with each other, that's fine. If you want to pick a simple, easy surface one, like I struggle with eating too much cake, whatever. I do struggle with that. That's a problem. What are some ways that Jesus has helped you address those defaults? Has any of those changed? Have you seen growth or change in your life? And maybe you're at the beginning of that journey and you don't have something to say there, but somebody else might have something that would be encouraging for you. Third thing, how can not dealing with your defaults affect your ability to share Jesus with others? Also, how can it just affect your life in general? What happens if you just decide, well, this is how I am, nothing will ever change, people don't really change? So why don't we take about 10, 15 minutes and discuss that, and when you're done, you can be on your way.